Hello, and welcome back. This is City of God video number 3. Now, I'm going to try to make this one shorter, no promises, but I'm really going to try because I actually want people to be able to watch these and digest these. So we left off last time talking about how Augustine was talking about how bad things are affecting both Christians and non-Christians. Now, I promised he was going to nuance that discussion a little bit because while we may be affected by the same sorts of calamities, we won't necessarily respond to them in the same way. So here on page 14, he discusses this. He says, "That being so, when the good and the wicked suffer alike, the identity of their sufferings does not mean that there is no difference between them. Though the sufferings are the same, the sufferers remain different. Virtue and vice are not the same, even if they undergo the same torment. The fire which makes the gold shine makes chaff smoke." He goes on a list of analogies here, and he ends up saying, "This shows that what matters is the nature of the sufferer, not the nature of the sufferings." So we're saying that somehow in the midst of identical sufferings, you can have wildly different outcomes for the people undergoing the sufferings, which is an interesting sort of, we talked about this sort of, it almost seemed deterministic or fatalistic, or we can get into the sort of predestination discussion with the one last time, but this time Augustine's saying, actually there's a high value placed on someone's internal moral character and how they respond to God's providence. And so he goes on in the next couple pages discussing this, and basically what he comes down to is that for the righteous, for the virtuous, for the Christians, this is a really good opportunity to have your faith tested. And that's not in like a sort of like, oh, I am feeling sad today, my faith is being tested. It's in life-threatening circumstances, and our immediate response might be to say, yeah, but aren't some things really bad, like death, for example? And Augustine gets there, right? After all of these discussions about how suffering benefits the believers, he gets into this discussion about death. And this is one of the most hard to digest passages I think he's given so far. He says, he's got this like objector who says many Christians have been killed, many carried off by hideous diseases, like the one we're experiencing right now. And he says, I am certain of this. No one has died who is not going to die at some time. And that's kind of a strange thing to say. It's kind of uncomfortable. Death is not to be regarded as a disaster when it follows on a good life, for the only thing that makes death an evil is what comes after death. He says, but there is a wide difference between the body's instinctive shrinking and weakness and fear and the mind's rational conviction, which deliberately sets it free from the body's influence. So he's saying as Christians, we shouldn't really be worried about that death. Everyone's going to die. Now, this seems a bit flippant to me at my first reading, and the whole narrative about the mind's instinctive shrinking, or the body's instinctive shrinking from something, but the mind's acceptance of it, or rational apprehension of it, seems a little bit like weird Platonism is working its way into the Christian anthropology there. I'll leave that aside for a second and simply say that I think what we can say if we're reading this a bit charitably, Augustine is more providing a counterpoint to those who are overemphasizing the importance of our life here, this immediate life. And what we got to recognize as Christians, obviously, is that we're looking forward to, yes, a future healthy and lived life in the resurrection. And I think we can recognize that Augustine is also looking forward to that, and maybe saying, look, right now, even this worst extreme of death is not quite as bad as we make it out to be in light of that, right? That's the whole thing, is that in light of the city of God, in light of this future realized state, we need to recognize that our current sufferings should be framed in that perspective. And so I think another point building on that for us is saying that as we're facing death or despair or whatever trials or sufferings we're being put through, like, God died, right? God put himself through death, and from that comes the greatest life. So we might be recognizing that even in Augustine's flippancy, if we might call it that, he's challenging us to look beyond our immediate fear of death and say, actually, there could be a greater life here that we didn't expect. So to moderate a little bit, I want to go to one of my favorite sections in the middle. He references Job on page 17. He says, "There's a further reason for the infliction of temporal suffering on the good, as is seen in the case of Job, that the spirit of man may be tested, that he may learn for himself what is the degree of disinterested devotion that he offers to God." And he goes from there and he starts talking about the loss of earthly wealth. And for a lot of us who are focused on the economy or thinking about job loss, that like kind of hits home for Christians. We might not be afraid of dying yet, although I don't want to minimize that. Obviously, this coronavirus pandemic is in a very nebulous state, but I was thinking a little bit about this idea of the loss of these temporal goods that we might value a little bit too much. And Job is a really good example. He lost all of these things, and it went down, it kind of broke him all the way down to his fundamental, yes, he still had a righteous orientation towards God, but also at the end he gets rebuked for not having a fully right orientation towards God. And I think the same thing could happen in our lives. So the question is, how do we practice dying a little bit? And I bring that challenge up because most of us probably aren't ready or willing to just sacrifice something that we think is really, really important, like a job, for example. But we never know when those things might just be taken away like that. And so I'm wondering if a practice that we can engage in a little bit is a little bit of sacrifice, a little bit of accustoming ourselves to that idea of, hey, this temporal world is not all that there is. We're looking forward to this eternal kingdom. So maybe thinking about, like, what's the thing we could give up? Maybe it's lunch. Maybe it's dessert. What are the small fasts or sacrifices we can do that will help us in this project of recognizing the proper Christian response to suffering? I hope some of that made sense. I know this is a lot to wrestle with in Augustine, but I think that's a really valuable thing to be doing, especially for those of us who are a little bit sequestered at home, who have leisure and might be tempted to go to the opposite extreme of laziness or sloth or gluttony or greed or whatever it is, to engage in a little bit of healthy asceticism. My prayers are with you as we do that. I'll be thinking about how to do that in my own lives, and I look forward to the next video.